at this crowd. This is great. Great. It is, I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity already to see the exhibition, but it is absolutely fantastic. And I think we had the opportunity to go downstairs to see all the work that the museum here had done too, and the work that you had done with them in finding those artifacts. Why don't you tell us first of all about the exhibition, David?
Well, of course it originated in Toronto. The idea for this show came up 20 years ago, and I was very excited about it. And I always say that expectations lead to suffering. So it was a wonderful idea, but would it ever happen? And this was at the Art Gallery of Ontario, one individual responsible for the concept, but management changes. So the director of the Art Gallery of Ontario, who entertained the idea, all of a sudden disappeared to New York, to the Museum of Modern Art, replaced by another American who was quite excited with the idea, and then all of a sudden he was gone to the Whitney Museum in New York. So it's sort of, the idea died, and 10 years ago, I was informed that it's on the books. We're going to do it. And then there was a long period of silence again. And 5 years ago, I was informed that it's a go. We have to start working on this. The exhibition ran in Toronto from February to June 2011. And when the decision was made to bring it to St. John's, some remarkable person decided we're going to mount a complimentary exhibition in collaboration, the archives in collaboration with the museum. So all these wonderful things appeared, and I believe there was so much stuff, you couldn't see the trees for the woods, so I came down and made specific choices, things that I knew would relate strongly to the images in the show.
Yeah.
And that's all very nice, but when I saw the installation downstairs, I couldn't believe it, because that's one thing to choose stuff, but then to bring it together and to label it and so on, and it's really quite a remarkable. Forget about upstairs. Downstairs itself would be sufficient. Yeah. I mean, that's quite a remarkable, and I'm glad to know that it's going to be here for a year, and then it's going to travel to the Labrador, Grand Falls, and Corner Brook, so that'll be quite amazing.
Now we get to the part where I get to ask you questions that
Yeah.
I think are populist in nature, questions I've been waiting to ask you for a long, long, long time. So first of all, were you a happy child?
Well, I think so. I think so under the circumstances, because I was born and grew up in a very unusual situation. My father had married as a very young man, 17 or 18 years old, and 5 children, and his wife died 6 weeks after the 5th child, and here he was sort of with this family. So my mother appeared from another place, somewhere up in the bay, Bragg's Island. All of a sudden, my mother appears in the household, of course not welcomed exactly by the children from the first marriage. And, you know, it was a very sort of strange situation so soon after the death of the first wife. Mm-hmm. And then my mother, 17, she had 5 children. And I was the first, and my brother came along, 2 small children, other children. There were problems. And this is very, very personal, but I remember as a very small child, a group of men coming to the house, because my mother went berserk, and a group of men coming to, and had smashed out every window in the house, and had every dish and so on. And a group of people with a constable. We had a constable in Wesleyville. And they came and tied my mother up. I guess you would call it a straitjacket. And she was taken to the lunatic in St. John's. It was the asylum, the lunatic asylum. And she was there for a year. My father brought her back and so on. So those were very difficult circumstances. But, you know, we lived in a community, a strong community, very tribal, so we were looked after one way or another.
Yeah.
And life was sort of normal in terms of going to school, playing hockey, football, which was always a kind of form of soccer, on the marshes and frozen ponds in the winter. And the church, of course, was a strong element in the community. So you would be singing in the choir and going to church Sunday morning and afternoon Sunday school, and then back in church again Sunday night. So it was a very tight situation. School, we were very fortunate. Wesleyville, a very strong Methodist community. The most important thing in the world was education. We had very good teachers, and I was blessed with 2-3 individuals who were really outstanding teachers. And then we had a very unusual thing for an outport. We had the Wesleyville Regional Library. A lady came every Wednesday afternoon and lit the fire in the building, and it had books from floor to ceiling, only Wednesday afternoon and Saturday afternoon. There were magazines, Time, Life, always carrying articles on art and so on.
On art?
Yes, yeah. So Time magazine would have a section on art, and Life magazine would have big articles from time to time. So those magazines were there, and I had full. I don't remember a great number of people aside from myself who would be there. It would be Mrs. Best and myself. There was one book in the entire collection on the subject of art. And I took it out and I read it and reread. I did not have the courage to keep it. But, and then eventually I discovered another book in the community, which I borrowed permanently. And it's in the display in the room here, Makers of Florence. And inside the cover is a big stamp, Reject from Dalhousie University. And I guess the books they didn't want, they sent them to Newfoundland. And this particular one ended up in Wesleyville, and it had a huge influence because Makers of Florence, it contained stories about all the really great Renaissance painters, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Brunelleschi, the great architect, Bramante, the great architect, Giotto, the father of modern art. And I discovered at a very early age that some of the greatest people who had ever lived were artists. And that was a tremendous revelation.
That obviously emboldened you, but when did you recognize yourself as an artist, or even before then recognize that art was important to you? How old were you?
I was in kindergarten, and my kindergarten teacher was quite amazed because I was able to use scissors and cardboard and cut out all sorts of birds and animals and so on. And then that's where it started. It was recognized immediately. I'm in grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. But it was all drawing and crayons and so on. And a woman in a community, a neighbor, came into St. John's every winter. Her brother was the Honorable Captain W.C. Windsor, Uncle Billy Windsor, and she would come in and spend, a widow, and would come in and spend the winter with her brother. And she came back in the spring one year with a 10-box watercolors and a brush, and I discovered watercolor painting. So there was a tremendous, of course, you know, children wanted attention, and this young boy who could draw and paint attracted a lot of attention, and I enjoyed it. Other boys probably were hockey players or whatever, and so I just continued, and it was supported all the way through.
I was going to say, I mean,
That
you were lucky, you were
library.
valued. That was valued.
Absolutely. Well, again, and this is part of the Methodist interest in reading and writing, the idea of having a gift,
Right.
being able to dance, being able to sing, being able to write poetry was considered a gift. And it was admired and considered wonderful, a wonderful thing. And people couldn't believe it, you know, that all these paintings, likenesses of people and so on. And so it was encouraged. And
I'm always amazed by the body of work that you have produced in a certain, of recollections of a certain time period, of your childhood leading up to the time that, you know, you left for the Ontario College for Art and Design. I mean, obviously, you come back to Newfoundland every year, and I know you continue to do work that's still inspired contemporarily, but a lot of it, and what we know of, was from that period of time. So you were a bright little kid. I mean, you were absorbing everything around you.
It had to be, and with a very keen imagination.
Yeah.
And ambitious, and wanting to find out, wanting to find out. And of course, it got me into trouble constantly. You know, we would
Could you talk a little bit about the trouble?
find ways of getting into buildings. We knew there were interesting things in there, and we would find ways of sawing up through floors, or picking locks, or going up into the second floor and opening up a board so we could lower ourselves down.
It's like an episode of The Little Rascals. I had no idea that this is where this was going.
To have access to tools so that we could build forts and rafts and so on. And we were, one of my best friends recently passed away, and he was a master bomb builder. And we would steal small amounts of gunpowder from various people and create these wonderful bombs with rope fuses and try to make bigger and bigger bangs. And it's amazing that we're still here because we used glass jars with screw tops to create. And we would light the fuse and run and hide behind rocks and wait for the big bang. And on one occasion, there was no big bang. So Cyril, my buddy, got up and went over to have a look, and of course, bang. And hair, eyelashes, no glass. So the explosion must have gone straight up, and he survived, but without his hair, without his eyelashes. And so it was very, very interesting childhood, especially for me, because my father was skipper of a Labrador schooner, and I would go with him in the summertime down to the Labrador area, up to as far as Cook's Harbor and Cape Harrison.
You were 5 or 6.
5 or 6 years old. My mother and my grandmother were hysterical because they knew I was going to be washed overboard. I mean, what? The men were not going to be able to watch me running from stem to stern all the time. But I found out in recent years that one particular member of the crew was given the job to keep an eye on me as I ran around. But my mother was sure I would be washed overboard or would disappear. But it worked out.
You're here.
And of course, it was a bit of a relief for my mother also to have me away for the summer. And I would cause trouble on board even at that age because the galley, the forecastle would have, of course, the galley, and the cook would have all sorts of goodies in a cupboard, dried apple, apricot, and raisins, and figs and all sorts of things, and of course it was tremendous. And when I discovered one day there was a lock on this door, I was very indignant and proceeded to remove it, and it was very interesting stuff. I was such a bad boy that on one occasion my father said, the next time we go to St. John's, I'm going to sell you to Uncle Benny Mercer. And Uncle Benny Mercer was a gentleman who came down to the wharf, and he would have all sorts of goodies, you see, to sell. And on one occasion, he actually said, okay, you're finished. I'm selling you for $1. And there must have been some arrangement with Uncle Benny Mercer, because my father handed me over to him, and he gave my father $1. And I think, I promised to be good from now on, and there was exchange with me again. So.
The paintings of that time, of when you were a child growing up in Wesleyville, whether it be icebergs or whether it be boats or whether it be people, they're epic in stature and they're larger than life. And I guess, is that because it was seen with the eyes of a child? Everything was bigger.
Most likely, there's a particular scale, and it has to do probably with being a child, and seeing that gigantic schooner being built, and of course it would feel like the Ark, so gigantic out of water, and to enhance the stature of those people, probably there's something happens in the design or the composition, or it's a mystery actually how it happens. The idea and the drawing, and it moves forward, and when it's finished, it's hard to believe that you've done it. It's almost as if someone else has done it for you. And there's a tremendous mystery about the process.
Do you still have recollections? I mean, do you still have, oh, I forgot about that person, or I forgot about that incident? And
it's unlimited, an unlimited subject. If you live to be 1,000 years old, you would not be able to achieve the ideas, which I constantly write down in a book. And I look at them from time to time, and eventually some of them might appear to be quite silly, and you would not really want to turn it into a visual image. But the strong ones would stand out. And now there's a dark side to life in the outports.
You'd never know it by your work.
And when I say dark, all sorts of things that I have really not touched on.
Oh.
And I'm reluctant to go there. So.
Could I ask what you mean by that?
Well, suicide, really bad things that would happen from time to time. A mother killing all her children and then drowning herself. On one occasion, some strange person appeared in the place, as my father would say. This strange man appeared in the place and started preaching. No one knew where he came from, but he was very charismatic and very evangelical, and everyone was quite worked up about it and prepared for the coming, which was to occur at daybreak on such and such a day.
Wow.
So everyone went down to the landwash and waited, and the sunrise came, and there was no second coming, and hysteria set in. And this is where the woman killed her children
Gosh.
and then drowned herself. So that's quite a powerful idea, and you could, the stuff of literature, the stuff of poetry, the stuff of art, and so it has enormous potential.
How old would you have been when that happened?
Probably 5 or 6, and it was much later that someone took me to the cemetery and showed me the graves and told me the story.
It almost seems like those things, though, would be kind of graphic and tragic consequences of a scene that you set, maybe more subtly, without necessarily having to go there. I mean, your work is imbued by that, by that darkness.
Memory, you know, things I experienced myself. My father's memory,
Yeah.
which would be his father's memory. So there are times when I feel like I'm 150 years old because of the oral tradition passed down, all sorts of very interesting. So at the age of 10, 12, 16, I was listening to people in their 80s talking about their childhood and their grandfathers and their experiences. So the tradition of storytelling, no television, no radio, no newspapers, and the gathering in various houses. And we were, again, blessed in Wesleyville because there were at least 5 great storytellers. And we, as children, would make sure to go to a particular house if we knew that Uncle Elijah Mullet, whose portrait is in the show here, and there's a wonderful photograph of him, as he was a great master watch on the imaging, but he was an incredible storyteller and had this experience of the Labrador and life on the Labrador, which is a great story not yet completely told about the Labrador fishery, all the schooners that went down and the tragedies and the incidents over a long period of time. And then, of course, this particular gentleman was a common sealer in his youth and then became a skipperman to the Labrador and a very valued master watch, a man of great experience and expertise at the seal fishery. And so he had a lot to tell, including an incredible story about his mother who lost control completely and ran off into the woods, stark raving mad. And it was necessary to get together a group of men to go and look for her. And they found her 2 or 3 or 4 miles in the woods and brought her out to Wesleyville and placed her between 2 mattresses. And in the next few days, there was a wonderful funeral, a wonderful church service, and she was no longer in danger of killing her children. And so this is, and there's a lot of this. And when I speak of the dark side of life in the outports, and a great deal has been written about it still, you know. And, but I haven't really attempted to use it as visual material.
Elijah Mullet's Dream is one of my absolute favorites by you. What was he dreaming about, if you can indulge me? I'm just really curious.
Elijah Mullet dreams. Well, of course, if you're down on the Labrador,
yeah,
you're out at the seal fishery, you're thinking of the comforts of home and family.
And just to set it for people who aren't familiar with the piece, but he's asleep, it looks like, on a sealing boat.
Yes, he's on a sealing ship and he's dreaming about the comforts of home.
Yeah. Well, I must say I'm quite taken with the fact that there's so much that maybe it isn't given to visual work, but so much stuff that's even darker that we weren't aware of. But maybe I'll bring it back to something that I guess it can still be quite dark, and that's mummering, which is a constant theme. But I'm sure when you were 5 or 6 years old, just as I was when mummers first visit the house, it's kind of, what is going on?
Mummers were nocturnal, mysterious, you can imagine, small children. They were used also to discipline children. If you don't behave, I'm going to give you away to the first mummer that comes to the door. And so these wonderful, mysterious, nocturnal figures in groups wandering through the community and approaching the house and knocking on the door. And of course, they had a language that they spoke, speaking while drawing in on the breath. And they were allowed, what a mess, they were allowed into the kitchen.
Yeah.
And then the process of trying to identify the individuals would begin, and you were supposed to unveil. You were supposed to expose yourself if you were identified. And then if you identified George, well, his wife must be in the group, so you would eventually, and if you succeeded in naming everyone, then you could have some form of merriment, food and drink and so on. And they would proceed to another house. The small children would be a whole group of small mummers between probably 6 and 7 or 8 o'clock.
Right.
And then they disappeared, and the big people appeared. And
But you were particularly frightened of the lone mummer.
the lone mummer was a very strange thing. There's a print in the show around on this floor, I guess, a lone mummer inside. It was unheard of for one person to knock on the door, a mummer. And it was a terrible omen of death in the family, impending. So if you wanted to really penalize someone or really hurt some family, you would dress up as a mummer and you would go and knock on their door. And of course, you would never be allowed into the house. You would walk away, and of course, the house would be in turmoil. And I actually remember on one occasion, Newfoundland had become a part of Canada, and we had a thing called the RCMP. And the RCMP were trying to find out who that person was. So the lone mummer was a great sort of strange thing. Mummering was really quite amazing because if you were fed up with someone, you had to be you needed people to help you pull your boat out of the water. You needed people to help you put the roof on the house. Everyone helped everybody. So if there was a problem with an individual, you could dress up as a group of mummers and you could go to his house and you could say, now look here. And you could castigate him and tell him off.
You had a liberty you wouldn't normally have.
Exactly, as a mummer. And now being dressed as a mummer, of course, provided an opportunity for other opportunities of amorous nature and things you would never do under normal circumstances. You could approach a very shy man, could dress up as a mummer and approach a woman and not feel too bad about it, you see. He could be accepted or rejected. So mummering, and it was very regular activity. And I understand that from my father's experience and memory, it changed because when he was a child, it represented an almost medieval activity with constructions, horses, and hobby horses. And in my time, it was strictly and probably unique to Bonavista North, a lace curtain would be, a veil would be used. But then, and we see from the exhibition, one unusual feature of the community was a mummer that would appear with a mask, a helmet. And we knew the owner of that, but he would loan it to people. So it was confusing. And the other very interesting thing is that mummers from nearby communities, 4 or 5 miles away, people would dress up and come into Wesleyville.
That's not fair.
From Pound Cove or Brookfield or Badger's Key, and that would be a total, you would never be able to guess. And it was disconcerting for the mummers to come in, and you were unable to identify them, and they would get up and leave.
Yeah.
So that was slightly unnerving, but great fun.
Mummers figure largely in this exhibition, and also objects, and literally, I mean, objects that you either print on their own, or in groups. And I'm thinking of, like, you know, trigger mitts, the door, the cod splitter. I mean, these are objects, I guess, of fascination for you?
Of everyday life, and they have a great potential for meaning beyond the object. And the door, the mitts, worn by the mummer, is one hand revealed, one hand concealed.
Yeah.
And all sorts of things have been read into that. But for me, it was strictly a graphic design. It'd been interesting to have one hand uncovered and one hand with the mitt, simply as a graphic, artistic expression, more interesting than having 2 mitts. And, but in the world of science or psychiatry or the psychiatric world, this could have all sorts of implications. And but for the artist, it might simply be a visual thing. People read a lot into whether or not it's a frontal presentation or a profile. Complete frontal face or one half of the face. So it becomes very, very complicated.
Early on in your work, and there's examples of it again in the exhibition, you tackled, I guess, mysticism, and it manifests itself in your paintings as, you know, visions of a bull, or, you know, the sealers being deluded on the ice, or having delusions of bulls or of a ship coming to rescue them. And then it just seems like, all of your work, it's hard to put your finger on it. Hopefully people know what I'm talking about, but all of your work has a degree of mysticism imbued in it, that just, you seem to make, I don't know whether it's the child, you know, the childlike recollection, the child's recollection, but it's like everything's epic and somehow mystical, that you've made our history and our culture somehow epic and mystical. Is that something that just kind of happens, or is it something that you're aware of?
Being born and growing up in Bonavista North, which I feel has a sublime wind, everything moving overhead, the ocean, winter where things are black and white, fog is made down off Cape Friels, so it's never absent. No sooner does the land warm up a little bit, and the fog bank 4 or 5 miles out off Cape Friels moves towards the land. The darkness of winter. There's a tremendous melancholy in the landscape, which I've felt even in the summer. And it might have something to do with the fact that generations of people have come and gone. And you get those feelings in parts of Europe where you know that for 1,000 years people have come and gone, and there's some kind of spirit world. But then the climate, all the northern regions of the world have some kind of spirit world. And it was quite common to see a ghost in Wesleyville. And there are all sorts of stories about, fantastic stories of the spirit world. And so, again, that's part of the lore and the storytelling. And then as an individual, of course, if you're a reader, which I was from very early on, and a great teacher of Shakespeare, and at a very early age, being aware of Julius Caesar, Macbeth, Richard I, II, III, all those great Shakespearean plays. And once we had Macbeth, we wanted Julius Caesar. And so it's just full. And then in the schools we had anthologies of English literature, all the great English poets. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, A Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and all these wonderful things. Now, whether or not my classmates were affected the way I was, but it had a profound, and you wanted more and you wanted to read more. So you would have absorbed all sorts of fantastic ideas, which perhaps translated into your way of seeing and feeling in the artwork. And as a student, of course, in Toronto, we were absolutely fortunate in having really great teachers. Like one example of being told that a work of art has to have a life of its own. It has to have this unexplainable quality, which was not always easy to achieve, but if you were able to produce a work with this mystery and this quality, it represented art. Not just a pretty picture, not something that was nice, not something that was just simply decorated, but it had this life of its own, and it's something you always strive for in the work, and it's very elusive. Manual skill will not produce it. Spending 10 years rendering a painting, which becomes a tremendous work of skill, it might not have this. Skill will not produce this incredible quality. And the same is true in writing and poetry. The poem has some wonderful, undefinable quality, which would make it great.
I wanted to ask you, there's two, as familiar as I am with your work, there are two wonderful parts of this exhibition that, one is going through a fire down on the Labrador and going through the entire process. It's in one of the rooms back there, of from a basic sketch and idea to basically, I guess, the final print, which of course everybody knows to be the iceberg, the humpback, and the Labrador on fire. But also the video from, the film from the National Film Board. I mean, how you produce a piece is so painstaking. And it wasn't until I saw you do it and saw you with the copper plates and that I really began to appreciate how difficult the work is. When did you decide, was it at the Ontario College? It was at the Ontario College of Art that you decided that this is how you wanted to produce work.
The Ontario College of Art, first year, one of the great drawing instructors was constantly on the lookout for students who could draw. But he was also head of the drawing, not only part of the drawing and painting department, but was head of printmaking. And he spent a lot of time looking for candidates for the printmaking department. And my great talent was in drawing at that point, not being able to paint or knowing anything about color or design, but a natural ability to draw. So I was one of the people selected for second year to move into printmaking. And that's where I discovered etching. We were required to do lithography, etching, silk screen, and woodcut. And then in your third year, you could gravitate into one of those. And I chose etching because it was a combination of drawing and painting and sculpture and fantastic. And of course, I was fascinated also by the idea that it was a democratic art form.
Yeah.
That you could make more than one. And the great history of printmaking with Rembrandt, Albrecht Dürer, and the father of the political cartoon, Daumier, the great French artist who did these incredible daily prints, lithographs that inflamed the public or inflamed the government. And so everyone was able to experience those images.
You were talking about art earlier and just how it has to last, tell a story, and have that mystery about it. And that's when you know. When you go through the several series of copies of prints, when do you know it's ready? When do you know I can stop now?
It's an intuition. It's hard to, it's never really finished, but you reach a point where
you're exhausted.
You have to stop. There's no point going any further. And of course, there's the experience of going further and ruining the thing. And then you have the struggle to try and save it. And it's such a thing as it can be so good, it's bad. It can be such a virtuoso work that it loses something. It becomes a work of great skill, and it hasn't got that mysterious quality, which you can't arrange for, you can't plan to turn this object into a work of art.
Yeah.
It has to happen. And it's strange, it's accidental, and it is a mystery as to how it happens. And the entire exhibition is a mystery. I walk into that room, and it's hard for me to believe. It's almost as if someone else has done it. I can't believe. And what we see here, 70 images, there are 250. And this represents just a selection from that broad body of work. And there are a lot of wonderful things that are not included because it's a curatorial decision. Someone has decided that, we want this, yes, no, yes. So,
do you have difficulty letting go of that control and letting somebody else do that?
I'm interested in creating the work. I don't want to get involved with creating an exhibition. You would be consulted as to how things might move, what various directions, but not to really make. The show at the Art Gallery of Ontario had 10 works too many. They simply could not accommodate the extra 10 works. And Dr. Loughnane, who curated the show, said, I can't do this. You're going to have to decide which ones we're going to leave out. And it was very difficult because they were major pieces, but something had to be done to make it a manageable exhibition. And I'm amazed. I thought, well, my God, in Toronto are 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 galleries with all this work. What's going to happen when it goes to St. John's? It's going to be it will be necessary to cut it in half. And I believe through the genius of Caroline Stone, only one work has been eliminated. So that's really quite remarkable, and it feels very, very good. And you might argue that it's probably even better than Toronto.
Hear, hear. As you gain notoriety earlier, as your career started to take off, what did your mother think of it all?
Well, my mother lived in another world. My father and mother lived in another world. And they were aware of the strange activity. They watched it while I was growing up drawing and painting. And they knew I was in Toronto studying drawing and painting, and they would see things. It didn't bother them or affect them in any way. And they thought it was a wonderful thing, and they were quite proud. They never told me, but everyone else knew. So, but then they were aware of the fact that people did paintings, because we did have earlier people in Wesleyville who were painters, and there's an example in the exhibit, a magnificent, we might describe it as a primitive painting. It's quite sophisticated, of a schooner. And so we were aware of, and there was a mystical figure from Cape Friels with the name of John Vincent, who I think we needed very badly at one point. We needed to have an artist. And Mr. Smallwood created a great artist, a great Newfoundland artist, and his name was John Vincent. And he painted a portrait of the king, he painted a portrait of the Pope, and so on, and so on, and so on. And indeed, he did paint a portrait of the king, and he did paint a portrait of the Pope from photographs. But we all believed that there was an audience with the Pope, and that the Pope had sat for John Vincent from Cape Friels. And the king arranged, had sat for Mr. Vincent. But he was an extraordinarily gifted man, could play the violin, could make the violin, and then play it. He was a genius, incredible, and had great skills in architecture and drawing and painting and doing portraits of people, but had never studied in his life, and went along with the mythology of, And it's very interesting because in more recent times, Cassie Brown thought, what a fascinating figure. And he's still alive. I'm going to go and see him and interview him and find out all the great material for a book. And she made arrangements and went to see Mr. John Vincent. And actually, the family were not too thrilled with the idea of her seeing him and speaking with him. But she managed to do it. And he did have a studio. And this, I believe, was in New York. And on the easel was quite a wonderful painting of Jacqueline Kennedy. And there was a story to go along with it. And Cassie actually phoned the White House and inquired about this painting that had been commissioned of the First Lady. And they knew nothing about it.
and he was busted.
And she was tremendously disappointed. And then in even more recent times, Mr. Smallwood was in Toronto I believe he had turned 80, and he was speaking to the Empire Club in Toronto, which was 80 years old. And and I was supposed to be there at the head table. And on our way up on the elevator, he turned to me and he said, John Vincent was a fraud. and I was quite taken aback. But then, my first visit to Government House, here was this wonderful painting of King George VI by John Vincent. And it was a very good painting. And it indicated, of course, that there was some kind of fantastic talent there.
Yeah. How did your family or the community react? Because you're painting real people who were alive or had lived and were in people's memories. And I'm just wondering if they ever found that intrusive.
Well, it caused all sorts of problems. because nobody seemed to be thrilled with having their picture painted. And again, it might be something similar to people not wanting to have their photograph taken. And Uncle Elijah Mullet, and the painting is here in the show, was tremendously unhappy. And he never spoke to me again.
Oh.
He was so upset with how I had portrayed him. And then we had a very interesting character. We had a very interesting character in the community, a savant, and he went from house to house and sang songs and ballads, and quite remarkable. And people would give him a cup of tea or give him dinner, and in exchange for singing "God Save the King" or one of the long Newfoundland ballads, really quite remarkable. And so, over a period of time, I did a series of drawings that ended up as a painting. Now, the entire family was hysterical. His brothers were really, they had some kind of feeling that I was making fun of their brother, Jake. And Ephraim Calloway, as in Ephraim Calloway's door, decided he was going to make away with this painting if he could get his hands on it. And I came home from school one day, and our neighbors said, "You know, Dave, Ephie Calloway is looking for you." And so, honest to God, I went into the kitchen, took the 12-gauge shotgun from over the door, and took it out to the building where the painting was. And sure enough, Mr. Calloway came along and banged on the door, and banged on the door, and banged on the door, and then all of a sudden, the entire door came down. And he came in, and I was there with the gun. And there was a little exchange. I warned him that if he made one more move, of course it wasn't loaded. And he said, "I'm going to see the RCMP." And he never did. He backed off. I never heard from him again. And being quite brazen, I painted his mother. And it's a wonderful little painting of Annie Calloway, Jacob's mother, Ephraim's mother, 3 brothers, Jacob, Alphaeus, and Ephraim. And their father was Fred. But Fred was a great Methodist, and of course the Methodists were big on the Old Testament. And so we had Eli's and Solomon's and Jacob's and Alphaeus and Ephraim and Obadiah and Absalom, Noah, and all these great Old Testament figures walking around in real life. And that was part and parcel of the fabric of the community, and it was sort of epic from that point. Just the names in the community were quite remarkable. And some unusual names for women. Kernapak. You know, where did the name Kernapak come from? And someone said, "Oh, she was a daughter of Abraham." One of the 3 daughters. There was Jemima, a second daughter, and Kernapak. So we called her Kernadi. Yeah. So that was really fantastic, interesting stuff. And with the storytelling on top of that, and the incredible sort of action of the seal fishery, and the preparations for the seal fishery, and the Labrador, really quite amazing atmosphere.
I know you've said that the way of life that you had when you grew up and the way of life that you portray in your art is now gone. And I'm just wondering if you see yourself as a curator of that place at that point in time, or if you ever thought you would. I mean, if you ever thought back then when you started working that really you would be portraying something that would disappear.
Well, you know, I made no conscious attempt to record. Some people feel that it's wonderful what you've done. You know, you've set out and you've achieved your goal of recording. It really never was that way. You know, it was part and parcel of growing up and a desire knowing that I had to have a subject. And all this great material was there to be mined. And it's unlimited, you know, with imagination is everything. And a simple thing like Ephraim Callaway's door could provide material for a lifetime of painting as a point of departure. And indeed, that simple, commonplace, typical, everyday object which you find in, or would find, and you can still find in the outports, has inspired over 100 works of art, drawings, paintings, etchings, and it hasn't stopped. It's now moved into a sculptural form of painted objects, wood, and sort of having sprung from that one object.
I think on behalf of the audience, well, first of all, let me say on behalf of myself, I mean, you write questions, and you really kind of hope you never have to use them. It has been an utter joy to listen to you, and thank you so much for being so revealing in your answers and so frank, and for telling such wonderful stories. It's been wonderful to have an evening with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
David Blackwood.